When I asked about college applications, my father said, "School makes women into whores like your mother." He said it while tearing up the acceptance letter I'd hidden in my dresser from the state university that offered me a full engineering scholarship, and I stood there watching 4 years of secret studying disappear into pieces. Dad, I earned that scholarship. Perfect SAT scores. Perfect grades. He laughed and threw the pieces in the trash. You got those grades by flirting with teachers? Just like your mother flirted her way through college before destroying our family with her education? My mother had left him when I was 12 after getting her nursing degree because he'd been controlling and abusive, but he'd rewritten history. Mom left because you wouldn't let her work after graduation. You made her waste her degree. He slapped the table hard. Women don't need degrees, they need husbands. Education fills their heads with feminist garbage about independence. Look what it did to her. Turned her into a career woman who abandoned her family. She hadn't abandoned anyone. She'd fought for custody, but he'd hidden assets and hired expensive lawyers while she had nothing. I want to be an engineer, Dad. I'm good at math and science. He stood up, towering over me. You know what you're good at? Cooking, cleaning, taking care of your father. That's what daughters do until they get married. I'd been his unpaid servant since Mom left. I'm 18. I can legally go without your permission. He smiled coldly. With what money? I'm not paying a cent. And if you leave, you're not welcome back. Ever. Good luck being homeless for some useless degree. He'd already sabotaged my attempts to work by refusing to let me get a driver's license or have a phone. I'll get loans, work study, find a way. He walked to his filing cabinet and pulled out papers. Already called the school. Told them you declined. Said there was a family emergency and you wouldn't be attending. They gave your spot to someone else. He'd destroyed my future with a phone call. You had no right. That was my acceptance. He laughed again. You're my daughter. Everything you do reflects on me. I won't have people saying I raised another educated whore. He used that word constantly about any woman with education. Education doesn't make women promiscuous, Dad. That's insane. He got in my face. Your mother was a virgin when I married her. Innocent. Pure. Then she went to nursing school and suddenly she had opinions. Ideas. Male friends. Education corrupted her. Mom had made friends and discovered she deserved better than him. So your plan is to keep me prisoner forever? He nodded. Not prisoner. Protected. You'll stay here. Take care of the house. When you're 25, I'll find you a suitable husband. Someone who appreciates innocence. Someone like him who wanted a servant, not a partner. That night, I called my Aunt Grace from the neighbor's phone while Dad was passed out drunk. He destroyed my college acceptance. I'm trapped. Grace lived 3 states away and had been trying to get custody since Mom died in a car accident 2 years ago. Pack what you can. I'm coming tonight. She drove 8 hours straight and arrived at dawn. Dad woke up to us loading my things. Where do you think you're going? Grace stood between us. She's 18, an adult. You can't stop her. He tried to grab me, but Grace pulled out her phone. Touch her and I call the police. I have recordings of your abuse from your ex-wife. She documented everything before she died. Dad went pale. Mom had been building a case to get me back. Those recordings proved nothing. Grace played one. His voice screaming about educated whores, threatening violence, admitting to hiding money. The court will be very interested in these, especially the part about tax evasion. He backed off. Take her then. But when she becomes a whore like her mother, don't come crying to me. Grace helped me into her car. The only thing she'll become is successful, unlike you. We drove away while he screamed about betrayal and abandonment. Grace had saved money for my college. Your mother sent me money every month. Said it was for your education when you finally escaped. Mom had been planning my freedom even while dying. I started college that fall. Graduated with honors. Got my engineering degree and then my master's. Dad never contacted me again. I heard from cousins that he told everyone I'd run away to become a prostitute. That education had corrupted me like my mother. Nobody believed him. They all knew the truth. He'd tried to trap me in his miserable world where women existed only to serve men. Last year, he had a stroke. The phone came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing structural calculations for a bridge project. Unknown number from area code 517. I almost sent it to voicemail, but something made me answer. A woman's voice, professional and tired, identified herself as a nurse from Mercy General Hospital. She said my father had suffered a stroke 3 days ago, and I was listed as his emergency contact. The words hit me like cold water. I hadn't spoken to him in 12 years. Hadn't thought about him in months. My first response was to hang up and pretend the call never happened. Instead, I asked what she needed from me. She started talking about medical decisions and care plans and rehabilitation. I stopped her. I told her I wasn't involved in his life and couldn't help. She went quiet for a moment, then asked if there was anyone else. I said no and ended the call. My hands were shaking. I stared at my computer screen without seeing the numbers. The bridge calculations blurred together. I grabbed my phone and called Grace before I could think about it. She answered on the second ring. I told her about the hospital call and the stroke and being listed as next of kin. Grace's response was immediate and firm. She reminded me I had no legal requirement to manage his care. She said not to let guilt manipulate me into giving up the peace I'd built over the past decade. She asked if I wanted to be involved at all. I said I didn't know. She told me to think about it carefully and call her back. The hospital called again that evening. I let it go to voicemail. They called the next morning. Voicemail again. By the afternoon of the second day, they'd left 4 messages, each one more urgent than the last. They needed someone to make decisions about his treatment. They needed to know about insurance and care options. They needed family input on his rehabilitation plan. The 4th message said they really needed to speak with me as soon as possible. I finally called back and asked to speak with his neurologist. The receptionist transferred me. The neurologist introduced herself and launched into medical details. Major ischemic stroke affecting the right side of his brain. Significant paralysis on his left side. Speech problems. He'd need months of intensive rehabilitation and would likely require permanent assistance with daily activities. She kept calling me his caregiver. She asked about my availability to attend care planning meetings. She wanted to know about my home situation and whether I could accommodate his needs. Every assumption made my stomach turn. I interrupted her. I said I needed to be very clear about something. I was estranged from him due to abuse. I would not be providing care. I would not be housing him. I was gathering information only. The line went silent for several seconds. When she spoke again, her tone had changed. She asked if there was anyone else who could take responsibility for his care. I explained that he'd isolated himself from everyone who knew the truth about him. He had no friends. His family had stopped talking to him years ago when they realized what kind of person he was. She asked about siblings or other relatives. I said there was no one. She thanked me for my honesty and said the hospital social worker would be in touch about next steps. I went to work the next day feeling like I was moving through fog. Raina found me staring at my monitor during lunch, the same spreadsheet open that I'd been looking at for an hour. She asked what was wrong. I gave her the basic version. My abusive father had a stroke. The hospital wanted me to be his caregiver. I told them no. Raina's face went through several expressions before settling on anger. She said it was horrifying that the hospital was pressuring me to care for my abuser. She asked if I knew my actual legal obligations. I admitted I didn't. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. She said her sister had dealt with something similar when their father got sick. She gave me the name of an attorney who specialized in elder care and family law. Cecilia Pendleton. She said Cecilia would tell me exactly what I was and wasn't required to do. I called Cecilia's office that afternoon and got an appointment for Thursday. Her office was downtown in a renovated brick building. The waiting room had comfortable chairs and art on the walls. Cecilia was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with short dark hair and glasses. She shook my hand and gestured to a chair across from her desk. I told her the whole story. My father's abuse, the destroyed scholarship, my escape with Grace, 12 years of no contact. Now the stroke and the hospital's assumptions. Cecilia listened without interrupting, taking notes. When I finished, she looked up and spoke clearly. Adult children have no legal obligation to provide care or financial support for their parents. None. The hospital was looking for the easiest solution, not the legally required one. She said I could decline all responsibility, and the state would handle his care through guardianship and Medicaid. I felt something loosen in my chest. Cecilia pulled up a document on her computer. She said we should draft a formal statement declining medical power of attorney and care responsibility. She asked if I wanted to document the abuse history as justification. I said yes. We spent an hour going through details. She typed everything into a legal template. When we finished, she printed 2 copies. One for me, one to send to the hospital. She said if they kept pressuring me, she'd handle all communication going forward. I signed the papers. She said she'd send them to the hospital that day and would call me if there were any issues. 3 days later, my phone rang with a 517 area code. Different number this time. A man identified himself as Constantine Burke, the hospital social worker. His tone was professional and careful. He said he'd received my statement declining care responsibility. He wanted to confirm that I understood they would be pursuing state guardianship for my father. I said I understood. He explained they'd apply for Medicaid to cover his long-term care needs. He asked if I had any questions about the process. I said no. He thanked me for my time and ended the call. No pressure, no guilt, just information. I sat in my apartment after the call and felt the weight of the past week start to lift. Constantine asked one more thing before ending the call. Did I want updates about major medical decisions or his death when it happened? He said it clearly, like he understood this was my choice and nobody else's business. I told him death notification only. I wanted to know when it was over, but I didn't want calls about surgeries or treatments or any of the daily decisions involved in keeping him alive. Constantine said he'd make a note in the file, and that was it. The call ended, and I sat there feeling like I'd just crossed some invisible line that I couldn't uncross. My phone started ringing 2 days later with numbers I didn't recognize. I let them go to voicemail. The first message was from a cousin named Georgina, who I hadn't heard from in probably 8 years. She said the hospital had contacted family members looking for someone to take responsibility for my father, and she was shocked I'd refused. She used the word abandoned 3 times in a 2-minute message. I deleted it and blocked her number. The next call came an hour later from another cousin named Robert. He left a message saying I should be ashamed of myself for turning my back on family. He said my father raised me and fed me and put a roof over my head, and this was how I repaid him. I called Robert back because I remembered he'd been at a family gathering where my father told everyone I'd run off to become a prostitute. Robert answered on the first ring and started in immediately about family duty. I cut him off and reminded him he'd sat there at Thanksgiving 6 years ago, while my father told everyone I was selling my body for money, and he hadn't said one word to defend me. Robert went quiet for a second, then said my father was just upset and didn't mean it. I told him if he was so concerned about family duty, he could take my father into his house and provide the care himself. Robert said he had his own family to think about and it wasn't the same. I said it was exactly the same and hung up. 3 more cousins called over the next week. I blocked 2 of them without listening to their messages. The third was my cousin Linda, who'd always been quieter than the rest of the family. She left a message saying she wanted to talk, but not to pressure me about anything. I called her back because something in her voice sounded different. Linda answered and immediately said she was sorry. She said she never believed my father's lies about me becoming a prostitute or any of the other garbage he spread around the family. She said she should have spoken up years ago and defended me, but she was scared of causing family drama. I asked why she was calling now. Linda said she wanted me to know my father had been alone for years because people eventually figured out what kind of person he was. She said his bitterness and cruelty drove everyone away, and the only people who still talked to him were the ones calling me now, trying to guilt me into taking him. She said even those people didn't actually like him. They just felt obligated because of some outdated idea about family loyalty. I felt this weird mix of sadness and satisfaction hearing that. Linda said she understood why I walked away, and she didn't blame me one bit. She said if she'd been in my position, she probably would have left sooner. We talked for another 20 minutes about her kids and my job and normal things that had nothing to do with my father. When we hung up, I felt lighter somehow, knowing at least one person in that family saw the truth. Dylan came home from work that evening and found me sitting on the couch staring at my phone. He sat down next to me and asked how I was really feeling about everything. I started to give him the standard answer that I was fine, but something broke open inside me. I told him I felt guilty even though I knew I shouldn't. I said I kept thinking maybe I was becoming the cold, heartless person my father always accused educated women of being. Dylan pulled me close and let me cry into his shoulder for a while before saying anything. Then he said, refusing to sacrifice myself for someone who tried to destroy me wasn't coldness. It was survival. He reminded me my mother fought to give me the freedom my father tried to steal, and honoring her memory meant protecting that freedom. He said my father made his choices, and those choices led to him dying alone in a state facility, and that wasn't my fault or my responsibility to fix. I cried harder because hearing someone say it out loud made it feel more real and more okay. That night after Dylan fell asleep, I got up and opened my laptop. I started writing down everything I remembered about my mother's fight for my education. The recordings she made of my father's abuse, the money she saved by working extra nursing shifts, the custody battle she was planning before she died. I wrote for 3 hours and filled 6 pages with memories and details I'd been carrying around for years. Seeing it all written out reminded me that walking away from my father was exactly what my mother would want. She'd spent her last years trying to get me away from him, and she'd left money with Grace specifically for my education. Every choice she made was about giving me a future he couldn't control. Choosing to protect that future now wasn't betrayal. It was honoring everything she sacrificed. 2 weeks later, the hospital called again. Different administrator this time with a neutral professional tone. She said my father was transferred to a state-funded nursing facility since no family members would take him. She gave me the facility name and address in case I needed it for records, and that was it. No pressure, no judgment, just information delivered and call ended. I wrote down the facility name and filed it away with all the other paperwork Cecilia had helped me prepare. I called Constantine the next day because I had one question I needed answered. I asked if my father knew I'd declined to care for him. Constantine paused for a second, then said yes. My father had been told, and became very agitated. He said my father tried to say something that came out garbled because of the stroke, but it sounded like accusations. Constantine added that the neurologist had noted in the file that my father's anger issues were making his rehabilitation much harder. I should have left it there, but I asked what my father tried to say. Constantine hesitated long enough that I knew I wasn't going to like the answer. He said it sounded like my father was calling me an ungrateful whore, the same word he'd always used about educated women. Something settled into place hearing that. My father had a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly, and his first instinct was still to call me that word. Nothing had changed. Nothing would ever change. I told Constantine I wouldn't be visiting or taking any calls from the facility. I said all future communication needed to be in writing only, and sent through Cecilia. Constantine said he understood and would update the file accordingly. The call ended, and I sat there feeling completely certain about my decision for the first time since this whole thing started. Cecilia called 3 days later while I was reviewing technical drawings at my desk. She said the state guardianship went through without any problems, and my father was officially a ward of the state now. Her voice sounded relaxed and professional, like she was closing out paperwork on a routine case. She confirmed I had zero financial liability for his care, and his Social Security would cover the nursing facility costs completely. I felt something loosen in my chest hearing those words because part of me had been worried the state would find some legal way to make me pay for him anyway. I asked what would happen to his house and all his belongings, since he'd lived in that same place for 30 years. Cecilia explained the state might eventually place a lien on his property to recover some of the care costs, but that process took years and wasn't my concern. I told her I wanted nothing from his estate and asked if she could document that officially. She said she'd prepare a formal disclaimer of inheritance that I could sign and file with the court, so there would be no questions later. I thanked her for everything, and she said she was glad she could help me protect myself from a bad situation. After we hung up, I sat there staring at my computer screen feeling like I'd just been released from invisible chains I didn't even know I was still wearing. Work became my refuge over the next few weeks as I threw myself into a major engineering project, redesigning a water treatment system for the city. I loved the clean logic of engineering problems where there were right answers and wrong answers and no messy emotions to navigate. My team needed detailed calculations for the new filtration system, and I spent hours running numbers and creating models. Raina stopped by my desk most afternoons to check on me, and I appreciated having a friend who understood why I wasn't playing the dutiful daughter role everyone expected. She never asked if I felt guilty, or suggested I should visit him, or any of that garbage people usually say when someone's parent is sick. She just brought me coffee and asked how the project was going, and treated me like a normal person, instead of someone going through a family crisis. Grace drove up for a long weekend visit in early November, and we spent Saturday afternoon going through old photos of my mother that she'd kept safe in albums at her house. We sat on my couch with 3 photo albums spread across the coffee table, and Grace told me stories about each picture. There was Mom at her nursing school graduation looking proud and happy in her white uniform. Mom at the hospital where she worked before she married my father when she still had her whole life ahead of her. Mom holding me as a baby with this expression on her face like she couldn't believe I was real. Grace said Mom was so strong to leave him and fight for custody, even though she lost that battle in the end. She said Mom never stopped trying to get me back and never stopped believing I deserved better than being his servant. We looked at pictures until the sun went down, and I cried more than I expected to, because seeing Mom's face reminded me of everything he'd stolen from both of us. Sunday morning, Grace told me something I'd never known before. She said Mom was planning to appeal the custody decision when she died, and had been documenting his continued controlling behavior toward me for months. Mom had been keeping a journal with dates and details of every time he called her names or threatened her or tried to turn me against her. She'd been building a case to show the court that his abuse hadn't stopped just because they were divorced, and that I wasn't safe living with him. Grace showed me copies of some of the journal entries on her phone, and I read my mother's handwriting describing things I remembered living through. Mom wrote about how he wouldn't let me get a driver's license or have friends over or participate in the school activities. She documented the verbal abuse and the isolation tactics and his obsession with controlling my future. Grace said Mom's death wasn't just tragic. It was the final theft of my chance to escape sooner, because she would have won that appeal and gotten me out years before I turned 18. That revelation made me angry in a completely new way. I'd been furious at him for years, but this was different, sharper, like a knife cutting through old scar tissue to find fresh wounds underneath. He'd stolen years from me that I could have spent with my mother instead of being his prisoner. Grace hugged me while I cried angry tears and said Mom would be so proud of everything I'd accomplished. She said Mom would be especially proud that I refused to let him control me even now when he was sick and helpless, and everyone expected me to take care of him. Grace said choosing myself over him was exactly what Mom had been fighting to teach me before she died. I started therapy the following week with a woman who specialized in family trauma and complicated grief. I sat in her office with its comfortable chairs and soft lighting and tried to explain how messed up I felt about the whole situation. I told her about losing my mother and escaping my father and now facing his slow death without any reconciliation or closure. I said I felt like I should feel something more than just relief and anger, but I didn't know what. My therapist listened to everything and then said something that hit me hard. She said I could grieve the father I deserved to have without owing anything to the father I actually had. She said those were two completely different people, and I had every right to mourn the loss of what should have been, while refusing to pretend the reality was different from it was. That made more sense than anything anyone had said to me through this whole mess. 2 months after his stroke, Constantine sent a brief email update that my father's rehabilitation was going slowly because of his bad attitude and refusal to cooperate. The physical therapist had noted in his file that he got angry during sessions and wouldn't try the exercises they gave him. Constantine said this wasn't unusual for stroke patients, but it was making his recovery much harder than it needed to be. I read the email twice and then filed it away in a folder with all the other documentation I was keeping just in case. I didn't respond because I'd already told Constantine I only wanted to know when my father died and nothing else. But I saved everything anyway because I'd learned from my mother that documentation mattered when dealing with difficult people. Dylan and I went on a weekend trip to the coast in late November to clear my head and get away from everything for a few days. We drove to a little beach town and got a room at a cheap motel right on the water. Walking on the beach Saturday afternoon, I realized I'd been waiting for some big dramatic confrontation or guilt trip that just wasn't coming. My father was simply fading away in that nursing facility dealing with the consequences of his own isolation and cruelty. Nobody was calling me a terrible daughter or trying to pressure me into visiting him. The cousins had stopped calling after I reminded them they'd known the truth all along. The hospital had stopped pressuring me after Cecilia sent her letters. Everything was just quietly resolving itself without any of the drama I'd been bracing for. Standing at the edge of the water, watching waves crash against the rocks, I told Dylan how strange it felt that the man who dominated my entire childhood was now powerless in some nursing facility 3 states away. Dylan picked up a smooth stone and threw it into the surf. He said my father had always been weak, just really skilled at making other people feel small to hide his own weakness. He said truly strong people didn't need to control and diminish others to feel powerful. That hit me because I'd spent so many years thinking of my father as this huge, threatening force, when really he was just a scared, bitter man who couldn't handle the idea of women having their own lives. I came back to work after the beach weekend and tried to settle into my normal routine, but my phone rang Tuesday afternoon with an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end introduced herself as my father's neurologist and asked if I had a few minutes to talk about his recovery progress. I felt my shoulders tense up immediately because I'd made it clear through Constantine that I didn't want updates unless my father died. She said she understood my position, but wanted to ask if I'd reconsider visiting him, because research showed that stroke patients with family support had significantly better recovery outcomes. I took a breath and kept my voice calm when I told her that his complete lack of family support was a direct consequence of his own abusive behavior over many years, and fixing that wasn't my responsibility. She went quiet for a second, and then started to say something about how difficult family situations were, but I cut her off politely. I explained that I'd provided extensive documentation about the abuse to the hospital and had formally declined any care responsibility through my attorney. I said I appreciated her concern for her patient, but my decision was final, and I'd prefer not to receive any more calls about this. The neurologist apologized quickly and said she hadn't actually read through all the documentation in his file carefully enough. She admitted she'd just seen that he had an adult daughter and assumed it was a normal estrangement that could be worked through with some encouragement. I told her I understood she was trying to help her patient, but some family relationships were broken beyond repair for very good reasons. She thanked me for being direct with her and promised I wouldn't get any more pressure about visiting or getting involved in his care. I hung up feeling shaky but also proud that I'd held my boundary without being mean or defensive about it. That same week, Raina stopped by my desk at work with an interesting opportunity. She said the local university's engineering department was hosting a panel about women in STEM careers and asked if I'd be interested in speaking on it. The panel was in 3 weeks, and they needed one more speaker to round out the group. I hesitated for maybe 2 seconds before saying yes, because I immediately thought about how my father had tried so hard to prevent exactly this kind of success. The idea of standing in front of college students talking about my engineering career felt like the best possible proof that he'd completely failed to destroy me. Raina grinned and said she'd known I'd be perfect for it. She gave me the details about timing and what topics they wanted us to cover. I spent the next few weeks preparing my remarks and thinking about what message would matter most to students who might be facing their own obstacles. The night of the panel arrived, and I sat on stage with 3 other women engineers looking out at about 100 students in the auditorium. We each talked for 10 minutes about our career paths and the challenges we'd overcome. I kept my remarks focused on the practical side of breaking into a male-heavy field, but I could feel my father's voice in my head the whole time calling me a whore for having opinions and education. The question and answer session started, and hands shot up all over the room. A young woman in the third row asked how we'd dealt with family members who opposed our career choices. I saw Raina glance at me because she knew this question hit close to home. I took a careful breath and shared a version of my story that left out the worst details but made the point clear. I said I'd had a parent who believed women shouldn't pursue higher education and who actively tried to prevent me from going to college. I explained that I'd had to choose between honoring that parent's wishes and building the life I wanted for myself. I told them I chose myself and never regretted it, even though it meant losing that relationship permanently. The room got very quiet, and I could see several students nodding like they understood exactly what I meant. After the panel ended, a small group of students came up to talk to us. 3 different young women thanked me specifically for being honest about family opposition. One girl said her parents wanted her to study nursing instead of mechanical engineering because it was more appropriate for women. Another said her father had told her she was wasting money on an engineering degree when she should focus on finding a husband. They all seemed relieved to hear that choosing yourself over toxic family expectations wasn't selfish or wrong. I gave them my work email and told them to reach out if they ever needed someone to talk to about it. Driving home from the university that night, something shifted inside me. I realized I'd been treating my father's stroke like this huge, defining crisis in my life, when really it was just another chapter in a much bigger story. My father had tried to trap me in his miserable worldview, where women existed only to serve men, and he'd failed completely. I had a career I loved and respect from my colleagues, and the chance to inspire students who were facing similar battles. His stroke and his slow decline in that nursing facility were just the final consequences of choices he'd made decades ago. My life was so much bigger than his attempts to control or diminish me, and always would be. I felt lighter than I had in months when I walked into my apartment that night. Dylan was making dinner and asked how the panel went. I told him it was exactly what I needed, and that talking about my success in front of students had reminded me that my father's story was ending, but mine was still growing. 3 months after the stroke, I got an email from Cecilia with a brief update. She said the state guardian had been managing everything smoothly and my father's care was stable. She wrote that I probably wouldn't hear anything else unless his condition changed in a major way or when he eventually died. I wrote back thanking her for all her help navigating the legal side of this situation. I saved her contact information in a folder on my computer labeled with my father's name, so I'd have it when I needed it for his death. It felt strange to have a folder waiting for someone to die, but also practical. I'd learned from my mother that keeping good records mattered when dealing with difficult people and difficult situations. Dylan and I were having dinner the following week when he asked if I'd thought about what I'd do when my father actually died. He wanted to know if I planned to attend a funeral or just let the state handle everything without my involvement. I put down my fork and realized I genuinely didn't know the answer yet. Part of me felt like I should go to prove to myself that he was really gone and couldn't hurt me anymore. Another part of me thought attending his funeral would be giving him attention he didn't deserve even in death. I told Dylan I hadn't decided, but I appreciated that I had time to figure it out without anyone pressuring me one way or the other. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. He said whatever I decided would be the right choice because I was the only one who understood what that relationship had cost me. Grace called me on what would have been my mother's birthday in late March. We spent an hour on the phone sharing memories of her strength and kindness. Grace told me stories I'd never heard about my mother's determination to finish nursing school despite my father's constant criticism and sabotage. She said my mother had studied in secret and hidden her textbooks because my father would throw them away if he found them. Grace said my mother had been so proud when she finally graduated and got her nursing license. We both cried, talking about how much she'd sacrificed to try to get me away from him. Grace said something near the end of our call that stuck with me. She told me that refusing to care for my father now was actually honoring my mother's sacrifice and not betraying some abstract concept of family duty. She said my mother had fought so hard to give me freedom and independence, and throwing that away to care for my abuser would make her sacrifice meaningless. I'd never thought about it that way before, but she was completely right. That night I sat down and wrote a letter to my mother that I knew I'd never send. I told her about my engineering career and how I'd gotten my master's degree. I wrote about Dylan and how he supported me without trying to control me. I described the scholarship fund I was planning to start in her name. I told her about refusing to care for my father, and how I'd built boundaries that protected the life she'd helped me escape to. Writing it all down felt like closing a circle she'd started when she saved that education money for me. I folded the letter and put it in a box with the few photos I had of her. Someday I'd visit her grave and read it to her there. Work called me into a meeting the first week of April, and I walked in nervous they were going to cut my hours or reassign me. Instead, my manager told me they were promoting me to lead engineer on a major infrastructure project the company had just won. It was a huge bridge renovation that would take 2 years and involve managing a team of 8 engineers plus contractors. My manager said they'd chosen me because of my technical skills and my leadership abilities. I sat there trying to process that I was getting this kind of recognition and responsibility. Walking back to my desk, I thought about my father saying women didn't need degrees, and I actually laughed out loud. He'd been so completely and totally wrong about everything. My education hadn't corrupted me or turned me into what he'd feared. It had given me exactly what my mother had dreamed of for me. The promotion came with a raise that felt like proof my father had been wrong about everything. I sat at my desk looking at the new salary number and thought about all the young women trapped like I'd been. That night, I opened my laptop and started researching how to set up a scholarship fund. I wanted it in my mother's name for women escaping controlling families who needed help getting to college. The application would ask about family situations and obstacles overcome, instead of just grades and test scores. I called Grace the next evening to tell her my plan. She answered on the second ring, and I explained the scholarship idea, while my voice shook with emotion. She went quiet for a moment, and then I heard her crying on the other end. She told me it was the most perfect way to honor my mother's fight and sacrifice. We talked for over an hour about the details, and Grace offered to help review applications, since she understood what these young women would be facing. I spent the next few weeks working with a lawyer to set up the nonprofit paperwork and establish the fund parameters. We decided on 2 scholarships per year with enough money to cover tuition and some living expenses. I was reviewing the final application forms when an email notification popped up on my screen from Constantine. The subject line said medical update, and my stomach tightened before I even opened it. He wrote that my father had suffered a second smaller stroke, and his overall prognosis was now poor. I read the email twice, sitting completely still at my desk. The strange thing was, I felt nothing dramatic. No grief or satisfaction or anger. Just a kind of numbness and acknowledgement that his story was reaching its end. I forwarded the email to Dylan without comment, and went back to the scholarship paperwork. That evening, Dylan came over and found me on the couch staring at my laptop without really seeing it. He sat down next to me and asked if the second stroke changed how I felt about anything. I thought about it for a long time before answering. I told him it didn't change anything because my father had made every choice that led to him dying alone in a state facility. Those were his choices about how to treat people and how to view women and education. They weren't consequences I created by refusing to sacrifice myself to care for him. Dylan nodded and squeezed my hand. He said I'd spent enough years carrying guilt that didn't belong to me. I opened my email and wrote back to Constantine that I didn't need further medical updates unless my father actually died. I kept the message brief and professional. Constantine responded within an hour saying he understood completely and would respect my boundaries while ensuring my father received appropriate care from the facility staff. His kindness made me feel less alone in this weird situation. I closed my laptop and tried to focus on other things. Thanksgiving arrived faster than I expected. Grace drove in from 3 states away, and Dylan helped me cook enough food for a small army. I'd invited Raina and a few other close friends who didn't have family nearby. We crowded around my dining table that barely fit everyone, and went around sharing what we were grateful for. When it was my turn, I looked at all these people I'd chosen to be my family. I said I was thankful for every person at this table, and for the life I'd built, despite every obstacle my father had created to stop me. Grace reached over and gripped my hand tight. During dinner, Grace started telling stories about my mother that I'd never heard before. She described how my mother had worked double shifts at the hospital to save money for my education, how she'd hidden cash in old nursing textbooks, and the lining of her winter coat because my father monitored her bank accounts. Grace said my mother had been so careful and determined, knowing that education was the only way I'd ever escape. Every story felt like another piece of my mother's love reaching across the years to protect me. Raina asked questions about my mother's nursing career, and Grace described her dedication to her patients even while dealing with my father's abuse and the custody battle. I sat there listening and feeling grateful that Grace had preserved these memories for me. The stories reinforced that I was living exactly the life my mother had fought and sacrificed to give me. After everyone left, Dylan and I cleaned up the kitchen together in comfortable silence. He asked if I was okay, and I realized I genuinely was. December came with holiday decorations appearing everywhere, and year-end projects piling up at work. I was in a meeting about the bridge renovation timeline when my phone buzzed with an email from Constantine. I waited until the meeting ended to check it. The message said my father was declining rapidly and had been moved to hospice care within the nursing facility. Constantine asked one final time if I wanted to visit before the end. I sat in the empty conference room and typed out my response. I told him I'd said everything I needed to say when I walked out of my father's house a decade ago. There was nothing left to discuss or resolve between us. I did add one thing, though. I asked Constantine to make sure my father wasn't in pain, because despite everything he'd done, I didn't want him to suffer physically. Constantine wrote back quickly assuring me the hospice team was managing his comfort care well, and he would be kept pain-free. Christmas week arrived and the office was quiet with most people taking vacation time. I stayed to finish year-end reports and close out projects before the new year. I was deep into a spreadsheet when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered and heard Cecilia's voice identifying herself. She told me my father had died peacefully in his sleep that morning. I thanked her for letting me know and asked what happened next, surprised by how steady and calm my voice sounded. Cecilia explained the state would handle all burial arrangements since he was a ward under their care. She said I had absolutely no obligations unless I chose to be involved in planning or attending services. I told her clearly that I wouldn't be attending any services or participating in arrangements. She said she'd note that in the file and my case would now be closed. We said goodbye and I set my phone down on my desk. I sat there waiting to feel something big, but mostly I just felt relief that it was finally over. My father couldn't hurt me anymore. He couldn't call anyone with more lies about me becoming what he always said educated women became. The phone stayed silent on my desk. No more messages from social workers. No more updates about his condition. I packed up my laptop and locked my office door behind me. The hallway felt quieter than usual as I walked past empty cubicles toward the elevator. Most people had already left for the day. I texted Dylan on my way down and told him my father had died that morning. He wrote back immediately asking if I wanted company or space. I said company would be good. He picked a small Italian restaurant near my apartment, the kind of place where we could talk without crowds pressing in around us. I got there first and sat in a corner booth watching people walk past the windows. Dylan arrived 10 minutes later and slid into the seat across from me. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand but didn't say anything right away. The waiter brought menus and water glasses. We ordered without really looking at what we picked. Dylan asked how I was feeling and I tried to put words to the strange emptiness in my chest. My father had taken up so much space in my head for so long. Even after I escaped him, even after a decade of no contact, he'd been this huge angry presence lurking in my past. Now he was just gone. Dylan said it was weird how people who hurt us can still feel enormous even when they're not in our lives anymore. We talked about my childhood and how my father had controlled everything from what I wore to who I talked to at the school. Dylan had heard these stories before, but he listened like it was new. He said he couldn't imagine how lonely that must have been. I told him the loneliest part was knowing my mother had tried to get me back and failed. That my father had won that battle even though he was completely wrong about everything. Dylan reminded me that my mother had still won in the end because she'd saved money for my education. She'd planned my escape even while she was dying. That was love that outlasted death. The food came and we ate slowly. I said the strangest thing was that my father could have known me if he'd wanted to. He could have apologized for destroying my college acceptance. He could have admitted that controlling me was wrong. He could have said he was proud of my engineering degree. But he chose his pride instead. He chose to die alone rather than admit educated women weren't what he claimed they were. Dylan said that was his loss, not mine. My father had thrown away the chance to have a daughter who would have visited him in that nursing facility if he'd ever shown real remorse. I'd been willing to forgive him if he'd acknowledged what he'd done. But he never did. He died still believing he was right and I was corrupted. That was his choice and I could live with it. We finished dinner and walked back to my apartment holding hands. The night air felt cold against my face. Dylan stayed over and we fell asleep with the television playing old sitcom reruns neither of us watched. The next morning my phone rang while I was making coffee. Grace's number showed on the screen. I answered and heard her crying before she said anything. She wasn't crying for my father. She was crying for my mother. Grace said she wished my mother could have seen everything I'd accomplished. My engineering degree, my career, my independence, all the things my father tried to prevent. I started crying too because Grace was right. My mother should have been here to see this. We talked for almost an hour about my mother's strength and determination. Grace told me stories about how my mother used to call her late at night after my father fell asleep. How she'd whisper her plans to save money and get me away from him. How she'd been so careful and strategic about every dollar she hid. My mother had been fighting for me right up until the car accident took her away. Grace said we should visit my mother's grave together in the spring. We could tell her everything about my life now. About the scholarship fund I was setting up in her name. About my promotion at work. About Dylan and how he supported me through all of this. I said yes immediately. Spring felt like the right time. Grace said my mother would be so proud, and I believed her. After we hung up, I sat on my couch feeling grateful that Grace had kept my mother's memory alive for me. January came cold and gray. The scholarship fund paperwork finally went through after weeks of legal reviews and bank signatures. I'd put in enough money to help 2 young women each year. The selection committee reviewed applications from girls trying to escape controlling families. Girls whose parents sabotaged their college plans. Girls who needed money to get away and build their own lives. The first 2 recipients got their acceptance letters in mid-January. I met them both at a coffee shop near campus. They reminded me so much of myself at 18. One girl named Sarah had a father who refused to let her apply to schools more than 20 miles away. The other girl named Jennifer had parents who told her college was where girls went to lose their morals. Both of them had applied in secret. Both of them had perfect grades and big dreams. I bought them coffee and we sat in a quiet corner talking about engineering programs and dorm life. They asked questions about my career and I answered honestly. I told them parts of my story. Not everything, but enough that they understood. I said the family members who try to hold you back don't deserve access to your success. You don't owe them updates or explanations or proof that you're doing well. You just owe yourself the chance to build the life you want. Sarah nodded and said her father kept calling her selfish for wanting to leave home. Jennifer said her parents told her she'd regret choosing education over family. I looked at both of them and saw myself reflected back. That desperate determination mixed with fear and hope. I told them they wouldn't regret it. That the freedom to choose your own path was worth every hard moment. They both thanked me before leaving, and I watched them walk away toward their futures. Work kept me busy through late January and February. The infrastructure project moved into its critical phase with the bridge renovation timeline accelerating. I led my team through design reviews and site inspections. Every day I proved my father wrong about women and education. Every calculation I checked, every meeting I ran, every decision I made showed that his beliefs were garbage. My career was exactly what my mother had dreamed of when she worked those double nursing shifts. This was why she'd hidden money in coat linings and old textbooks. So I could stand in construction sites wearing a hard hat and making things better. One evening in late February, Dylan and I were cooking dinner together when he asked if I'd ever thought about getting married. Not to him specifically, just in general. I stopped chopping vegetables and looked at him. He clarified that he was asking about me specifically now. I said yes, I'd thought about it. He asked what kind of wedding I'd want, and I realized I wanted something small. Just people who actually mattered. He agreed that made sense. Then I said something I hadn't planned to say. I told him I wanted Grace to walk me down the aisle. Not my father, obviously, but not some random person either. Grace was the one who'd rescued me. She was the one who'd driven 8 hours in the middle of the night. She was the one who'd stood between me and my father with recordings and threats until he backed down. She was family in the way that actually counted. Dylan smiled and said that was perfect. He said Grace would probably cry happy tears for a week straight. I laughed because he was right. We kept cooking and talking about hypothetical wedding plans that felt less hypothetical by the minute. March brought warmer weather and longer days. Grace and I picked a Saturday in early April to visit my mother's grave. She drove to my city the night before and stayed in my guest room. We left early Saturday morning with flowers and a folder I'd prepared. The cemetery was an hour away in the town where my mother had lived after leaving my father. Grace and I walked through rows of headstones until we found my mother's marker. It was simple granite with her name and dates. Grace set down the flowers while I opened my folder. I'd brought a copy of my master's degree, my promotion letter, the scholarship fund paperwork with my mother's name on it. I laid them on the ground in front of her headstone and started talking. I told her about my engineering career and the bridge project I was leading. About Dylan and how he supported me without trying to control me. About the scholarship helping girls escape situations like mine. About Grace standing beside me through everything. Grace added details I forgot. She told my mother about my perfect performance reviews and my team's respect for my leadership. About the apartment I'd bought and decorated myself. About the life I'd built from nothing after escaping. We stayed there for over an hour just talking to her, telling her everything she'd missed, thanking her for the money she'd saved and the recordings she'd made, for fighting even when the courts ruled against her, for planning my freedom even while dying. I told her that her sacrifice hadn't been wasted, that I'd used every opportunity she'd given me, that I'd become exactly what she'd hoped for and nothing like what my father predicted. Grace was crying by the time we finished. I was crying too. We left the flowers and the papers there as proof. Physical evidence that my mother's daughter had succeeded, that her fight had mattered, that her love had been strong enough to reach across years and death to save me. Standing there looking at my mother's name carved in stone, something shifted inside me. I'd spent years angry that my father never apologized, never acknowledged his abuse, never asked for reconciliation. I'd thought maybe I needed that closure, that deathbed conversation where he admitted he was wrong. But standing at my mother's grave, I understood I didn't need anything from him. Not his approval, not his apology, not his recognition of who I'd become. I had everything that actually mattered. A career I loved that challenged me every day. People like Grace and Dylan who supported my independence instead of trying to crush it. The freedom my mother had fought and died to give me. My father's story had ended exactly how he'd designed it, alone and bitter in a nursing facility, convinced the world had wronged him. But my story was just starting. Every project I completed, every woman I helped through the scholarship fund, every choice I made freely, proved that his attempts to trap me had failed completely. The life I was building was better than anything he'd tried to prevent me from having. Better than he could have imagined. Better than he deserved to witness. And that was enough.